speak to you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Happy Pentecost Sunday.
Happy Pentecost.
I was recently asked by someone here in the church community what Pentecost is. And I'm so glad they asked, because it's one of the most important feasts of the church, and possibly the most important one to turn our hearts towards in our own day. Pentecost was not originally a Christian celebration. It was a Jewish feast called Shavuot. Also Shavuot, there we are. Also known as the Festival of Weeks. It began millennia ago, originally as a thanksgiving for the first fruits of the wheat harvest. Like most Christian and Jewish holidays have their deepest roots in the rhythms of nature. But then it evolved in Jewish culture as a time of remembering when the law was given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. Pentecost comes, the word, from the Greek word for 50, since it occurs 50 days after the preceding holiday, Passover. So, that is why there were so many devout Jews from every nation visiting Jerusalem when the disciples were gathered there. So you've heard of Christian revivals, right? Revivals? So I'm thinking rather than a revival, this gathering of Jesus' followers on the Jewish Feast of Pentecost, that was the original Bible. That's the Bible that all the revivals are imitating. I made up that word, but I kind of liked it. Pentecost is when Jesus' followers received the gift of the Holy Spirit in a new and powerful way that was experienced, as we heard, like tongues of fire, whatever that means. We know that the Holy Spirit is moving through all things, above all things, the very breath that sustains our own breath. And we know that she was moving over creation in the beginning of time. But Jesus promised his disciples that the Holy Spirit would come upon them in a new way, empowering them, guiding them, teaching them. Pentecost, for one, is when barriers of communication were broken down, were mystically transcended, and people understood one another. Just imagine that. I've had conversations every week with my husband, both of us native English speakers, and so often we don't understand each other, or there's some misunderstanding. On this day, by the power of the Holy Spirit, barriers of communication were transcended as words were spoken almost directly to people's hearts. What a miracle. People understood each other. So far we've got this gift of the Holy Spirit, there's this gift of communication, but there's so much more. When people see what's happening in this story we heard, they start to wonder what all this means. So Peter gives a little sermon. And he says that it was to fulfill what was prophesied. And he reads from the Old Testament scriptures, "And your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. And your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even upon my slaves, both men and women, in those days I will pour out my spirit, and they shall prophesy." This Pentecost thing, it's not just for the apostles. It's not just for the leaders of the church. Another gift of Pentecost is radical invitation by God's Spirit to the visionary work of building up God's kingdom, an invitation to all. This is something we're all included in. Men and women, Gentiles and Jews, slaves and free. Do you see in that day and time how radical that invitation was? God has poured out his Spirit. And God has poured out God's Spirit on you. And you will see visions. You will dream dreams. You shall prophesy. And this is at the heart of why I wanted to have a town hall meeting today, to hear what God has placed on your heart. What dreams, what visions. Pentecost is when the early Christians' hearts were set on fire. They knew that all of this stuff that Christ had taught them, all of that he had entrusted to them in ministry and teaching, was too amazing to keep to themselves. Just a few verses later in Acts 2 that we heard from, there is a response to Peter's teaching. We only heard the very first part of his little sermon. It was a long teaching. And in response to that, more than 3,000 people that day became Christian. Talk about church growth. This day caught their hearts on fire to go out and to share the good news, to invite people to join them in following Jesus. What would that fire for radical welcome and invitation look like today? Do we have something special here at All Saints worth sharing? Who's hungering for this feast out beyond these walls, but just doesn't know that this is here, or what exactly is here, or that they're actually invited? Pentecost is also a day of recognizing that we are all empowered by the same Spirit. All, every single person in this room, ministers of the gospel with different gifts. Paul says, now there are a variety of gifts, but the same Spirit, and there are a variety of services, but the same Lord, and a variety of activities, but it's the same God who activates them all in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. You have rich, God-given gifts for building God's kingdom in this world. St. Paul names what some of those gifts are. He says sharing wisdom and knowledge, gifts of healing and prophecy and discernment. But there are also gifts of preaching and teaching, not just for clergy. The gift of singing and making music, the gifts of baking and cooking, the gifts of extending hospitality, the gift of a listening ear, the gift of an open heart, the gift of knitting, the gift of an eye for detail and organizing, gifts for building and repair and construction, and gifts for evangelism. The gifts and needs for building God's kingdom are manifold. So I ask us to consider on this day of Pentecost, what gifts has God given you that you are waiting to share? And what is burning in your heart?